But I do think if kids have access to free play in their early learning experience and then throughout their childhoods, it helps them do better in school with the things that they're being asked to do. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't look at instruction. And you probably already know, if you had to guess three letters of what I would say is
Ah,
the answer for teachers out there. The answer to what Stefan's talking about is designing instruction using.
childhood isn't broken, but it is being reprogrammed. This is The Slow Scroll, a conversation about kids, tech, and the slow work of growing up in a world built for instant everything. We're not here to romanticize the past or panic about the future. We're here to think harder about what kids need, what adults missed, and how schools can be a place to get it right. Each episode is a chance to untangle the messy intersection of tech, identity, learning, and growth with curiosity, honesty, and a deep respect for what childhood can still be. Hey, we're here today to talk about chapter 2. Well, not just chapter 2, section 2 of The Anxious Generation, which is titled The Backstory, the Decline of Play-Based Childhood. So part 2 covers chapters 2, 3, and 4, and we're going to spend some time talking about each of those. But before we jump right in, Vanessa, Debbie, overall thoughts. What do you think of this section?
I really liked this one. I will say I have exciting things to share as we move through this section on actions I took in with my own kids, based on what we were reading about and just kind of these conversations we've been having. So I have some exciting updates to share. And I felt a little nostalgic reading it because it was this idea of kind of, I think, how most of us can relate to raising, like being raised in a play-based, risk-taking childhood. And so I really actually enjoyed this section. Vanessa?
Yeah, I would say I also enjoyed it a lot. I guess I kept finding myself, yes, like reminiscing about kind of my own experiences, contrasting that to what, we're seeing in our professional roles and also, with our own kiddos. And then, like, my undergrad is in psychology. So I think my brain naturally kept wanting to like think about these things, as we're interacting with technology, how does that impact like the brain structures and the hormones that are released? And then, each of the chapters kind of touched on very specific things for certain age ranges. So excited to get into it, and also very curious for part 2.
Yeah, I'm right there with you with the nostalgia piece. Though I think people have a tendency to point to like they think about these things. I feel like the decade that's always referenced is the 80s for whatever reason. I'm not sure if he did it in here also. Maybe that's just his generation. But like there's always people who are like, back in the 80s, we blah, blah, blah. And like as someone who was born in 89, like the 90s and early 2000s were the realm I was growing up in. And so I don't know where I read it, but I don't know. We have a tendency to romanticize and look through the past in rose-colored glasses. And so, like when I first read this book in that first chapter, my red flags went up a little bit just around some of that data, and then, but then powered through. And then reading through this second part, I not as alarming, but I did kind of raise my eyebrow a little bit at. Was it really all that hunky dory? Like, there's a lot of things I think that we ignore when it comes to the childhoods of yesteryear or whatever. How much has that changed? But I think the conversation is absolutely valid. Debbie, I'm excited to hear about what changes you made for your kids because this was the one. Like this chapter specifically, I think I don't really remember the next section as much, but this section specifically was the first one that I think generated a lot of conversation between my wife and I around just what kind of childhood do we want for our two boys who again are 6 and 2. So what like what do we want them interacting with, and what are the kinds of conversations we're going to have, and what should we really be prioritizing in the types of experiences that they're having. So yeah, any other thoughts before we really just dive in?
No, I'm ready to dive in. I really just right off the bat on chapter 2 here in the beginning, when it talks about free play being freely chosen, and it immediately just made my brain go to over scheduling, over structuring, over I don't know, just helicoptering our kids' activities, and this idea that doesn't count as free play. It has to be, self-directed, self-chosen. The rules, the world, whatever the boundaries are coming all from kids, has nothing to do with adults. And so that is something that just jumped out at me right away. And I think even when I go to a park and watch people interact with their kids at the park, it's boggling how much we can intervene with the best of intentions, I'm sure. But something as simple as, letting your kids just explore there and come up with what they're going to come up with, is a big struggle. And I think about when my kids want to tell me they're bored, it lets me off the hook because it's not my job to entertain you. In fact, it's going to be better for you to go. And I always tell them, boredom is the step right before creativity sparks.
I'm sure they love that.
Oh, they totally love it. And so, especially when I get all excited for them. But you know what? When they really go off, it's usually true. So I just really liked how he kind of put that out into the forefront.
Yeah, and that was, I'm just thinking about back to when we adopted our first son, and you're that kid's entire world, and so you are constantly responsible for entertaining that child. Otherwise, if they're 2, it's a little different than if they're in this adolescent age. I think Haidt specifically calls out the critical ages being 9 to 15 in this chapter. And so, not quite there yet with my kids. But when you're talking about the little ones, unstructured free play, unsupervised free play could lead to serious harm or physical deformity or death, right? And so you're constantly all over them, but they're hard to keep up with. And so I remember the first time that I'll say I discovered play dates because my wife knew about them. But the first time we had another kid over to our house to play, and they just occupied our son, and they just played together for 2 hours, and we cleaned the house. It was like a miracle. It was so freeing that we weren't the ones driving the play for our son, right? And so now with 2, it's nice. They're close enough that they play together. And there's still, you have to, because our 2-year-old's a real hellion. And so we, I'm constantly, the other day, he had this little mini screwdriver that I was letting him play with because he likes to pretend to fix things and go around. I watched him try to stick it into a socket. He took the safety piece off and tried. That's not free play. That's electrocution, right? And so there's definitely that limit. But I think that speaks to the I don't know, the worry of unstructured, unsupervised play. And the reason that we started helicoptering or that we got more involved or over structured is because we are afraid of kids getting into irreversible trouble. You want kids to get into a little bit of trouble. You want them to be rabble rousers and explore the boundaries so they can learn those things. But what happens when they get into the kind of trouble where it has serious consequences or can cause some serious harm?
I mean, I do feel like they're a little bit, yes, but that is a little bit what childhood is for, is to learn how to navigate those. Because I don't think, and this is something trust me, I struggle with all the time when I'm if I can help you avoid an uncomfortable situation, great, especially with what you're talking about, a trip to the hospital. But there is a little bit of, that's how you learn, and a story I have about when my oldest was younger and I had been telling him he needs to ride his bike with his shoes on or like without flip-flops on. And I kept telling him and we kept having that conversation. And then one day, sure enough, he scraped the bottom of his toe and it really, sorry, I won't go into details. I know. But the funniest thing was he asked me, through his tears, he said, "Is this a lesson I had to learn the hard way?"
Oh, wow.
Oh.
And I said, "Yeah, buddy, I think so." And guess what? He never fought me on wearing shoes with the bike again. And so, I think about just being nostalgic about our own childhood. There were so many things my parents just said, "Don't do it because I said so. Don't do it because I said so." Well, of course I have to go figure it out and figure it out for myself. And there is a little bit like we are wired that way as much as we want to, I know better. I learned through my experience. Like, well, that's the whole idea of experience. And so, well, yes, obviously as parents, we have sort of these guardrails. I don't know if that's the right word, but these general parameters we can help them stay within. I do believe part of our job is to let them make those mistakes and learn how to deal with consequences.
Well, okay. So thinking about that, Debbie, I struggle with the challenge of allowing them, to make these mistakes, to learn from the choices that they've made. It also makes me think about like confidence and like risk taking in other spaces, and like, is it from the lessons that they learn, during free play that then they can take and apply in other spaces? You guys both mentioned kiddos and like things that they've done. So more recently, my youngest, she just turned 8, but she's been like begging to ride her bike to school. So we did kind of like a trial run, but there is a bridge that's involved in her getting from our house to school. And the bridge is very narrow. And technically it has like a button you can push that says like share the road, and then it flashes caution lights so that people are aware before they enter the bridge that there's probably some sort of bike or pedestrian that's using the space. But we walked our bikes across. We made it all the way to the school. Things were good. Then I had found an old video of my son where he was riding his bike in like a skateboarding park kind of thing. So they have one in the town that we live now, but it's all cement. So she decided she was going to do a couple of like the little baby hills, and we're like slowly kind of working on the turns and getting a little bit more confidence. And then she finally like really goes for it. But then she starts to go up this ramp, realizes like it's too high, has to go backward, but it's kind of like unintentional. And her bike, she can just barely like touch her tiptoes to the side. So then she falls over, primarily on one like leg ankle, and immediately is like, my ankle's broken. Like it's broken. Like she ended up being fine. No, she did not actually break an ankle. She immediately wanted me to call Dad so that he could come pick her up. And like I got her out of the space, helped her walk her bike out. We kind of sat on the side for a minute. I asked her to, try to walk on it a little. And then eventually like we made it all the way home. So how are we structuring like after the failures, I guess, is kind of my like wondering. And like how much do we as adults shape like what they take away from that? And yeah. I don't know if my response was good or bad, but
well, as a parent, it's never perfect, right? Like it's
absolutely.
That makes me think. Before we started recording, we were talking about just kind of this and that district that I was working in last week. And one of the things they asked was they're having the cell phone conversation. Do we take cell phones away in schools? And what do we do with that? And one of the things I told them was what I see a lot of districts making the mistake of is they'll say our kids need more in-person social experiences, and phones are inhibiting that. So we're going to make a phone-free school. I think personally that, and spoiler alert, it's one of the suggestions he makes in this book, right? I think that's a good idea. I think where we're falling short on that is you're not replacing it with anything. Like you're not, if you do that to kids, not with kids, if you don't explain to them why you're doing this, if you don't involve them in the conversation, and if you're not replacing it with spaces and time for self-directed or I forget the term he uses, Debbie, was it self-directed free play?
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
If like you're not providing the structures for that or the support or the guidance for that, then you're just setting kids up for the wrong kind of failure, And something you said, Vanessa, made me think, like we tell kids all the time, we learn from failure, and that's great. Like I am as a teacher, I fail all the time, but then we don't do a good teachers on an individual level, I'm sure do, but as a system, holistically, we are not set up to support kids in learning from that failure. There's this video, I can't remember if I've mentioned this or not already, but there's this video that I show teachers in some of my workshops in PD about this kid learning to do a backflip. Have I shown you guys that?
I don't think I've seen that one.
I just found it on Instagram at one point, and it was this like kind of clipped together video of this instructor who's like, he says, this kid came to me and said he wanted to learn to do a backflip. So here's what we did. And then I'll send you guys the video. I'll link it in the show notes. Like, it's really good because he coaches this kid through, I asked a colleague of mine, I said, I need your feedback on assessment for this. Like, what does this look like in the assessment? And one of the things he said was, this is a good example of the confidence competence cycle. Like, you need to build confidence alongside competence. Like, it's okay if you're not competent to do a backflip in the first step, because the first step right now is just tucking your knees, right? Or it's falling back on this platform. And then we are slowly pulling some of these structures away. That way, like, I can't just tell you to go do a backflip, but I can coach you through this cycle where I provide the necessary structures for you to fail, but incrementally grow. And I think that is where like the conversation is falling short with phones in schools, because if you just take away a phone in school, you just take away, like, just ban phones in school, kids' first inclination is just to, okay, what are the ways I can get around this? If you're not having the conversation of why this is important, like, hey, you're being robbed of free play. No kid cares about that. Well, I shouldn't say no kid. Some definitely see the insight to that, but the vast majority of kids are like, who cares, boomer? I'm not sure if they even still say that. Like, it's like, why does this matter to me? And if we're not having that conversation and replacing the time that they're normally on their phones with opportunities and guidance to have that opted in free play or exploration or socialization time, then we're not doing any good.
Yeah. Oh, it's so complex, because I'm with you where it is a great tool. There are so many, and this was always my struggle with the cell phone policies, because on one hand, I was a never cell phone person. Like, oh, we have Chromebooks, we have other ways we can access these things. But on the other hand, like, this, helping them learn how to use this tool that is always going to be with them. Here you go, people, media literacy, to use it for very intentional and specific purposes. And yes, academic purposes when you're in an academic space. That is something we also, I feel like we can't just say, ban them, don't ever have them out, because we all use our phones for work. We all use our phones for purposes beyond just social and entertainment. And so helping them learn how, to me, that's a digital literacy piece. And that is it, which ties into so many times I need to use my phone for picture. You know what I mean? Like, there's just the phone is part of a step in what it is I'm trying to do. And so I don't think we want to completely inhibit that. We just need to help kids understand, like, we are in an academic place. This is where we're going to use our media for academic purposes. When you're home and you're in an entertainment space, by all means, And so, yeah, I think partly by having those phone-free spaces during the day, like lunch and passing period and things like that, is part of that. But I think we have to be a little bit flexible. And maybe that's something you build up to. Like, maybe it starts out as you take it all away and build back up to that. But I think that's a piece, like what you're talking about, that we're missing. And And to your point of we shouldn't be doing this to kids, like exactly, like they need to be part of this conversation. And I disagree. I think that if they understood the benefits of free play and how even as teenagers that there's still benefits that can be had from it, I think they would find that interesting. I think when it has to do with their own brain and their own development and what's happening in their bodies, I think they're pretty interested.
Yeah, no, so I should maybe rephrase that. I think they're absolutely interested. I think where they're at right now, they're not, right? Because they're not, their attention isn't pointed towards that. And he says something that I wrote down I thought was super interesting. Like right towards the beginning of chapter 2, he's talking about how learning is social, and I can't find it right off the bat, but I wrote it down in my notes. It's a kid's job is to learn the rules of society, right? And I mean, it goes back to what he talks about in part 1 in the introduction around just like embedding yourselves into societal norms and like immersing yourself in that. But if a kid's job is to learn society, rules on the internet are so different than rules in person. And if you are not engaging in those rules, those societal norms, then I mean, you might as well just never leave your house, right? It's the same thing. It's just not interacting with other people. And so, like, as I was reading this, I wrote down a couple of questions for the two of you, because I'd just be interested to hear like your thoughts on this as a parent and then your thoughts on this as an educator. So thinking about free play, how do you two encourage your kids to play?
Good question.
I can tell you mine. I say, go away. Go outside. We have a big yard. Go away.
So, okay. I don't know that this is necessarily the best approach. I think the way so far that we've kind of talked about it is like they will have screen time, both my son and my daughter. If I allowed them, like they would not stop on their own. So oftentimes I'm the one that's intervening. I don't have like set times, but I'll just be like, okay, which, maybe mine is work related or not. And you guys have been on the screen for a while. So we need to do a brain break. And we need to do something else. And then oftentimes I get kind of the side, Mom, well, what else am I going to do? Everything's so boring. So I might recommend like a couple things, but then I'm not the one that goes and gets the things. I let them kind of figure it out after I've given them some suggestions. And most of the time that works out fine. On occasion, I will get a little bit of like the frustration initially, especially with my younger one that is just turned 8. But because we've had a couple conversations around it and, like our brains need time away from screens, I feel like we're getting to a better place about that. How about you, Debbie?
Yeah, I feel like that has changed in the last few years as my kids' ages have changed. When they were younger, we had all sorts of spaces set up around the house that were like their spaces with toys and things like that. So it wasn't usually too hard for them to, go find something to do. My kids have always been really good about imaginative play. Like when we turn the TV off and it's like, nope, figure it out. The 3 of them will come up with all sorts of silly games. And sometimes they'll get excited after dinner, like, let's go finish, cats meowing or whatever it was they were doing. And it's like they have these silly names for them. So again, like that's what happens when you just are saying like, sorry, this isn't an option. Go figure it out. My daughter's very artistic. So usually when she's in that space, like she'll find something creative and artistic, and she's got all sorts of supplies that we have set up for her that she'll go have free reign with. My oldest is very athletic. So his usual go-to is like go out and shoot or play catch. Or, when he was little, he used to set up drills for himself in the front yard and would go out and do that. It's kind of crazy. I know he's
like
a different
cone drills.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And like jumping over things. Yeah. It was crazy. And then we're lucky though, because we do live in a neighborhood where there's lots of houses in our little horseshoe loop here that there's constantly kids out in the especially this time of year, there's kids out in the neighborhood. So they're always riding bikes, they're playing, and then on top of that, a lot of our social groups, we have family friends who our kids span, anywhere from 5 years old up to 12 years old. And so we have these mixed ages of kids just running around, playing together, their thing. It reminds me of Kick the Can, but they love Ghost in the Graveyard. It's like a hide and seek tag game in the dark that they love.
Fun.
But that was like Kick the Can for us when we were kids, So, and we live in a space where like they can go out and do those things. And so, I think that is something that we were intentional when we chose to live out here was those aspects, So what we may have given up in access to fancy restaurants and, great shows and, things like diversity and things like that. You know what I mean? Like we knew we were giving those things up, but because we wanted to give our kids an opportunity to, I guess we're both nostalgic and like maybe have a chance to be raised a little bit like how we both were.
Yeah, I guess, and I have it on easy mode, right? Because my kids are so young. And so they're not really fighting me yet, especially now. Like we're recording this in May. It's beautiful. This is like one of the nicest times in the area because it's not oppressively hot. It's going to be like 75 today and sunny, beautiful, beautiful. So just go outside, go play. In the winter, it's a little bit different. We're blessed. I'm very privileged to have a pretty large house. And so like they can find their different spaces in there. And I'm just, I know that's on the horizon. It's going to be a little bit harder, because I don't really get any grumblings if they're on. Like this morning before the bus, I took my youngest to daycare, and there was a little bit of lag time where I needed to be working, and so I let my oldest watch. He's been really into Mary Poppins, so it's like watching Mary Poppins. But the other thing is like that screen time is all monitored by me. Not that way. If he has a question or if he's engaging with something, or we can be asking questions about it. I actually did see an interview with the author of the book, and he was talking about like good uses of screen time. And one of the things he said was, don't put your kids in front of CoComelon because it's like these 30-second bursts of like crack for your brain. Like it's just not good. He said, put them into like long form stuff that has like moral dilemmas and a plot where they can be asking questions. And then ideally you're with them while they do it, which was interesting. So like on the way out to the bus, we had a little conversation about Mary Poppins because it's a very imaginative movie. So that's one of those little shifts. Like if there's any sort of screen time, I'm trying to prioritize him creating, or at least we're present there with him. My second question on that was, what does this look like in a classroom?
Okay, so I'm so excited that you asked this, Stefan, because I was thinking about part of this chapter was talking about like natural learning systems and hearing us all share. Like we as parents have some sort of presence in that learning and that modeling. But then I, to your point and to Debbie's point, I don't know that we collectively as a society have thought about how we're modeling this. And when I say this, I mean like technology and smartphones and that sort of thing and finding that balance. So Debbie, earlier you were talking a little bit about that in the school setting. How are we helping them see it for academic purposes versus these other things? And I think that is more challenging because, in the physical world, like we can see those things and know the questions to prompt, or we can gauge by reaction. Whereas in the digital space, especially phones in particular, I think that's a little bit harder because not everyone is necessarily looking at the same thing at the same time, though it can be designed in that way. So it got me thinking about, well, who is modeling this for them? Who is helping them figure out what is appropriate in which space, and like how are we having conversations? So then I started to think about ways that it could be embedded in some of our content areas. And because we're doing a media literacy event series right now, we had talked about some of the standards and then the skills that go along with the standards. And a lot of the ones that we chose to highlight happen to be in health. So then I'm like, I haven't been in a building with a health teacher for a while, but like, are these types of conversations coming up? So I think we often there's a lot of conversation around bullying, but are we being intentional about like moderation and like, how are we balancing screen time with all of these other pieces? What are some academic purposes that we would want to model for the kids in the classroom? What would that look like? And then I was thinking, I don't know, gosh, maybe in that like 2012 to 2016, I think there was kind of this notion like you're not going to get away from kids having access to phones. So you have to start learning to teach with it. So I remember early on, granted more with like college age kiddos, we were talking about like using polling features and that sort of thing to engage them in that academic setting. But at the time I wasn't working with, K to 12. So anyway, all of that to say, I think it's an interesting time and it warrants discussion, both professionally and personally. And I do think we need to involve our kids, the students, and I was also thinking about the family.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking more along the lines of like, what does free play look like as a teacher? Like, I mean, I like as a seventh grade, this is always my lens, seventh grade English teacher, right? It's the next chapter. I know we've been talking about chapter 2 mostly the whole time, but we've been bleeding into everything else. In chapter 3, he specifically cites like defend mode and discover mode, and like these different like ways our brain function. And like he defines discover mode as like it fostering curiosity, autonomy, resilience, and like that's what we want for our students in our classrooms. And you can build relational trust and community and society and learn those societal norms by doing hard things, not necessarily dedicating an hour a day to talk about specifically the social emotional learning standards. Or like, I think those intentional conversations around bullying are important. Like, you need to shed light on those things. But the sustainable way to do that is to build those into your practices in the classroom. And so I think media literacy, like you said, media literacy is the perfect avenue for that, or it's a really good playground for that area. But I'm thinking about, how does a teacher foster like opt-in free play style learning in their classroom without it just turning into play? Because there's a difference between doing projects and doing project-based learning, and the latter is where the learning happens. The first can just be really fun, but you don't actually accomplish anything. And I think we have a tendency to fall into doing projects and we lose the learning. Like, my answer to this is teachers need to spend more time with their standards. Like, you can never spend enough time digging through the intended learning, working with your PLC, understanding what you want, and like having that collective efficacy, like working together with a PLC to creatively and passionately support and meet the needs of your learners, and then provide a structured environment for sure, but build in time for them to be curious, for them to have their autonomy. I sat all day yesterday on like interviewing some teachers in our region for Regional Teacher of the Year, which has been my favorite thing that I've done all year, by the way. It was inspiring and amazing. And we had some great great conversations in between. And I was talking to a teacher at one of the high schools in our region, and she was saying that like there's just not any time built in their like structured and built in their day for kids to just be kind of hanging out and socializing because they're so packed at the gills. But what she has noticed is kids have a tendency to just linger after school because it's a place that they feel safe. It's a place that they feel comfortable. They just walk the halls and wander. And I think technically they're not supposed to do that, but she's going, it's great. They're socializing. They're not on their phones. They are interacting one-on-one, you know? And so I think teachers spending time with their standards and understanding the intended learning behind those things, that way you can appropriately embed those a little less structured or creativity driven learning experiences in your classroom. And then also building in time in the school day to allow kids to just chill and be a little unstructured. And I think the problem with that is that's where all the behavior happens, right? It's like all those unstructured, unsupervised times are when the bad things happen in school. But
well, and I kind of guess I took a little bit of a different approach with this in the sense that I don't know that it's the duty to bring free play into the classroom. But I do think if kids have access to free play in their early learning experience and then throughout their childhoods, it helps them do better in school with the things that they're being asked to do. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't look at instruction. And you probably already know, if you had to guess 3 letters of what I would say is the answer for teachers out there. The answer to what Stefan's talking about is designing instruction using UDL, the Universal Design for Learning.
I was going to say, is she going to say it or just going to leave people hanging?
I'm just going to leave them hanging. Leave them hanging. Because that brings in a lot of these natural, like, curiosities and that reflection piece. And I think that if that's what free play helps them build, is this resilience and this ability to keep at something and try and be creative in their approach, and then bringing in the risky play too. This idea that risky play reduces these fears. And I remember being in the classroom and kids getting paralyzed because they didn't want to be wrong, because they were so worried about their 4.0 and that they didn't actually care to understand why I wanted them to write a certain way, or, you know what I mean? They just wanted to know how to do it so they could get the grade they wanted. They weren't doing it for the knowledge. And so I just think that there's a lot of answers when it comes to the education system that can be revamped to kind of build off what you naturally get when you have a like play-based childhood. And I do want to sort of transition us into the next chapter, the chapter 3 around the risky play, because this is another one where I loved how right off the bat he talked about how we are wired for this. Kids naturally want to do this and challenge themselves, and like they try something and have success, and then they want to try the next thing. And I loved, because I just think about, you know, again, like watching my own kids, being in the classroom, being with young kids, and you do see this just naturally come out during free play. Like the risk is inherently built in. And so I think I have lots to think of. I'll let it come up naturally, but there's just so many thoughts percolating in my head around how parents are so worried about the risk. Like what we have done, and it really ties back to this like over supervision in the physical world, but this idea of like physical, social risks, emotional risks, like this is how you learn. Mm-hmm. You learn when things don't go well and you have to reflect on it. You don't learn when you're doing everything easily. That's just doing stuff you already know how to do.
I also highlighted in here the trees need wind to make them stronger. That biosphere example he gave, beautiful. That just resonated in my soul, because if you remove all of the wind from a kid's childhood, they don't have any roots to make them strong. Yeah. And so they have to face that adversity, which means they got to struggle, and that's
Mhm.
hard.
Mm-hmm.
Love that. Yeah, I loved that example. And I didn't even know safetyism was a word. I mean, when he dropped that word, like, oh, this is this like over reliance and feeling like we have to be safe in everything.
Google spell check thinks it's not. It's underlined in red on my Google Doc. So.
Also, maybe he made it up.
But I think you're onto something, Stefan. And I just keep thinking about like manageable risk or like moderate risk. There are certain things where like, are they going to get bumps? Are they going to get bruises? But like in large part, they're going to be okay.
I think he says bruises, not scars.
So how do we create environments where they can still do those things?
Or give them access to environments. I think that's maybe part of the, like in the classroom, we need to manufacture those environments for sure. But I think if we're talking about outside of schools, it's not about us creating, it's about just letting them go, right? It's like that they need, if they need to do it authentically, we can't give them a synthetic environment that will manufacture risk.
That is like a whole other like bird walk we could take, but we don't have to go there. But what I want to add on to that though is this idea of and I need to find the exact spot in the book, but the same idea of youth sports. And this also piggybacks on a different interview I listened to about the kind of industrial sports complex that's happening in youth sports and just the business side of it that's taking over. But how I think we want to tell ourselves, oh, we put our kids in sports, like we're good on the free play piece, and it's not free play, especially when the adults are overly structuring the practices, the game schedules, you know what I mean? Like, and I do think that that's a place where a lot of free play for kids gets taken up because there's this need for us to keep our kids involved, and for good reasons. I'd rather have my kids, hanging out with other kids doing sports than having too much idle time. That is an argument I've made in my own head. But at the same time, it greatly reduces their energy and time for free play. You know what I mean? And so like after 3 or 4 days of running to practices and games and things like that, then the kids do want to just veg out a little bit. And so there's that part too that I think is, I don't know. And yes, it brings in risk. Like, sure, there's some inherent risk that come with playing sports, but I guess, I don't know. I guess another question I have, because then I have one kid who's very into it. And if he could choose, if he's out there choosing what to do with his time, it's going to be sports. And then I have 2 other kids where they're like, nah, it's not their favorite thing. And so I guess maybe that's an interesting piece too, is how much choice is involved with what they're doing. But yeah, I just thought that was a really interesting part too.
I'm so glad you brought this up, Debbie. I was in a digital literacy roundtable last week where some like nonprofits just doing some research. And so they just had a bunch of people come together and we all just talked about like digital literacy skills, and a bunch of students on there, which was awesome to hear from all over the country, and a couple of adults and educators. And one of the gentlemen was an Indigenous man from the west side of Washington. And he said something about how, I'm going to butcher this, and so please do not hold me to this, but this is what stuck in my brain as a middle-class 36-year-old white man. So please take this with a grain of salt. He said that they're, at least in his culture, what they've kind of lost because of the emergence of technology was societally or like culturally, you would like get the knowledge when you needed it and not before. And so now kids have access to anything and everything at some point, right? And there's no gatekeeping of institutional or systemic knowledge. And I think we have a tendency to operate of like, you should have access to everything. And there's like some equity issues around that for sure. But he was talking about how his culture was like, you learn from your elders when you needed to learn it. And so there's like some developmental pieces in there that he was kind of lamenting the loss of. And I just thought that was very, very interesting. And it makes me think of your sports analogy or sports example, because there's so much money in every level of sports. And like, there's a monetary incentive to hyper focus and overly structure a game. Rob these kids of the joy of playing baseball, football, soccer, volleyball, softball, whatever.
I feel like this is something my family in particular has really struggled with, and just kind of all of the pieces that you guys are mentioning in that balance. And, how do you know if you're making the correct choice? So we did do kind of that like next step up for my son last year. And
hockey, right?
Yeah, okay. Ice hockey. And it was like more travel, but then with that next level comes like additional practices. And then there's kind of the unspoken expectation that your child will be doing independent, skill development. And then with that, I think some parents in that space also will pay for all of the extra stuff. So I found where I kept landing is like, is the kid asking for the extra stuff, or is that like the parent that is wanting that for the kid? And so I kept coming back to like, what is the purpose of this activity? And like when we got started with ice hockey, like he just loved to skate. And he loved to play in a space where it felt like fun and it felt like home. He kept saying like, I just want to play with my friends. So the hard conversation that my husband and I and, friends of ours in this community kept having is like, what truly matters? Like for me, I want him to go into this and like, I want him to have fun. I want him to make friends. I want him to learn like the value of teamwork. And like, hopefully he'll come out with some lessons about like how to be a good human and like how to function in society outside of this.
Risky play, free play, like less adult supervision. I'm all for that. Like, I think that's important, and the least interesting thing you can say in a conversation I get is it depends. And like the right answer is the middle ground. And that is true. So I think the argument on the other side of this is that more adult intervention probably has made things safer, has prevented a decent amount of issues. And I can't remember if he said this or if I just wrote it down. Adult intervention can dismantle inequities and power imbalances. Kids cannot be trusted to not abuse power imbalances because they're kids. They're like kind of supposed to, right? And so like completely and totally unsupervised free play, I would argue, is no better than overly structured play, because you don't have the coach, the teacher, the parent involved to capture the learning moment, the learning opportunity. This makes me think, speaking of sports, put a 6-year-old in soccer this year, and it was everything you wanted out of 6-year-old soccer. Like all the kids just grouped and huddled around. It was a big chaotic mess, and the kids were having fun, and it was adorable. Just loved it. There was this one game where there was a kid on the other team who was clearly like 3 or 4 years older than everybody else. And like, we're watching going, what's happening? Like this.
He's dominating.
Yes. Like bowling kid, not hurting anybody. Otherwise we would have said anything. But all I could think of is maybe there's something I don't know. There's extenuating circumstances or something. But it's a little pathetic for the other coach to allow this to happen. Are you really interested in winning? that much in 6-year-old soccer, to let this like 10-year-old run around on the field, not showing any restraint, taking the ball, clearly more physically and emotionally developed, faster, more agile, whatever, right? And that type of stuff happens on playgrounds and limits accessibility for kids. And so then if your access is gate kept, you don't get those learning experiences. And so you need some level of supervision to break down the systemic barriers and provide a little bit of equity without coddling or inhibiting.
Yeah. Well, and I think, okay, I'm going to say the last thing and I'll transition us, but I think that with what you're talking about is that's the whole idea of the risky childhood and the risk-based play is that they have these opportunities to mess up and then learn, right? Without that coddling, and to be accountable and reflective. And how right now with kids having access to the internet, whether it's through social media or other platforms, and he does make the point on page 82 just around how these small mistakes in this time period in their life where they're just learning how to handle it are being played out on this very large, very public screen, that our young people aren't equipped. They're not ready to handle that large scale, like shaming, and even adults aren't great at that. And the other thing I want to just touch on, and I think it does take us into this second, because I think I see a connection between the two, but he also talks about this loss of community, this loss of trusting adults to have the best interest of my kid. And I will say this is something I do love about parenting in this community with these other families, is that I trust that if I'm not right there in the moment and my kid is not behaving in a way that is acceptable, another one of these parents is going to step in and like hold my kid accountable. And I'm okay with that because there is trust there, because we do work together, do, our kids' sports together. Like there is a trust there. But I remember telling my sister that, and she saying, "Oh my gosh, I would never correct another person's child."
Oh, interesting.
Because because of the fallout. And he touches on that, how we've lost this sort of it takes a village mentality in a lot of places, and how with that is this overarching accountability that comes with it. And so I think I feel like he could end the book here and I would be like, yeah, you've made a great point about this shifting in parenting, right? Because he talks about this over helicoptering, this like safetyism, trying to protect our kids and do better by them than maybe what we did, know better, right? And I feel like these are just as good of a cause, like we've said before, that while yes, cell phone use, screen use, social media is also happening, these things are happening too. Yeah. Slightly connected because we have more information that's traveling more rapidly, but also just this is the shift that's happening, and they're all playing into what we're seeing play out with kids. And so when we go into chapter 4 and he's talking about the puberty and the blocked transition to adulthood, again, from my, perspective, which is a white middle-class female perspective, this whole idea of rites of passage, I think the ones that have held up in our culture are maybe held up for reasons and values that reflect this loss of community.
Could you give me an example of that?
Well, I shouldn't say that. I take that back. We have things like marriage ceremonies and graduation ceremonies. So I feel like we do have those rites of passage. But I think things like a sweet 16, where in some cultures that age of turning 16 is rooted in other cultural shifts that happen, whether it's responsibility or honoring, coming into a certain era of your life. I just feel like a sweet 16 just means like, oh, I get to have a big party. And if my parents are rich, I get a car. And I don't know. So I just think that some of those rituals have lost a little bit of like significance and cultural meaning.
Yeah.
But I do think we sort of glossed over it in the last chapter too. But this idea of like 13 being this arbitrary number we've attached to being ready for social media, even though there's no rhyme or reason to why we would choose 13.
That might be the single thing I quote the most from this book is every time someone's like, well, what about the safety? And they can't use it unless they're 13. I go, you want to know something.
Yeah. But I think, I guess my bridge between these two chapters is this idea that I do think there's a connection between this loss of community and then thinking about these kind of rites of passage and how are we going to approach that. And I think he does lay out a pretty interesting digital ladder, of how you could do this. So I'm just, curious to what you guys thought about this one.
True. My brother's in the military. Did you guys know that like call signs for pilots are given, not chosen? Like Maverick in Top Gun, I know fake, but didn't come up with that call sign. It would have been given to him based off of some things that he did in flight school. I had no idea. My brother's a helicopter pilot. And so he was explaining to me how he got his call sign and some of the ways they gave, but it's this whole rite of passage where like you're going through these shared experiences, you hit these milestones and that develops community, that develops like socialization. Obviously that can go very wrong, but I think partially to your point here, Debbie, is a lot of those milestones were tied to like maturity milestones and extra duties and responsibilities and shifts in, like your role in society. And I do think some of those things have been lost, which is why, like, if I look at this, page 107, he's got this ladder from childhood to adulthood. That's not a perfect map on, cause you'd have to like tweak that based off of where you live and those things, but kind of love that. Kind of love this like ladder he's got to the point where at age 6, when our son started kindergarten, he became a more important contributor to the household. He has chores. We have a sticker chart for him. We involve him in that process. And that was perfectly developmentally appropriate for him and has had some real benefits.
Well, I think this is all really good stuff. And we could obviously talk about this stuff forever. And it is a breath of fresh air to be able to just take some time out of our day to have these conversations as people. Which I think is what really brought us together around this topic. And so for one, my little note on this ladder from childhood to adult was I was similar with Stefan, where I thought this was pretty great and at least a framework to start. And my question was, where do we start this in our own families, in our own friend groups, in our own communities? Is this something schools can get behind and promote? And so, I think putting some attention and visibility to that. And I think it's a tool that could help a lot of parents, especially if it wasn't just we're the only ones doing this. You know what I mean? If this was kind of some general, guidelines that we all adopted. So I really liked this section because I feel like it's talking a little bit about kind of where we've been, what we know about these child-based or these play-based childhoods and these risky play in our childhoods and this need to have these really clear transitions into adulthood and thinking about that through the digital lens here. I feel like this is like a really good job of kind of where we've been. And I think our next section, part 3, it's called The Great Rewiring, the Rise of the Phone-Based Childhood. And I think this is going to take us through, these next few chapters are going to take us through kind of what it's become And then I do think the book will cap us off on like, what are we going to do about it? But so I think this next section that we're setting up for is really kind of what we've become and our reactions to that. So I'm excited to kind of dig into that with you guys.
That's it for this episode of The Slow Scroll. These are messy and important conversations, and we're glad you're in them with us. If something sparked your thinking or unsettled it, we hope you'll sit with it, talk about it, and bring it into your work with kids. You can connect with us, ask questions, or provide feedback using the link to the feedback form in the show notes. Feel free to share the episode, send it to a colleague, or keep the dialogue going in your own circles. Just don't stop talking about what matters.
Perfect. Debbie, I don't think we could go slice this in somewhere else, but at the very beginning, you kind of teased some shifts you made with your kids, and did those ever come up?
A little bit, not really. Okay, so it has been like riding the bike to school. That was one. Vanessa, I didn't really want to like keep talking about that after you shared, but so my kids have been riding their bikes to school and then living in a small community. I did get a phone call from a mom friend that was like, I just want you to know, I'm not trying to be a tattletale, but Marvin did cross in an unsafe spot, like outside a crosswalk. And it was like in front of the middle school during drop off. So she's like, I had my eye on him because I was the car he went in front of. So she's like, I wasn't going to hit him, but it.
See, that's the way small communities should function. Oh, yeah. I love that. So then
it was great because then I was able, and he admitted it. He's like, yeah, I was in a hurry. And I was like, well, you can't be in a hurry. And so like we've talked. So now every time, and it was a great conversation and we have a plan. Like this is the route you need to take. These are the crosswalks you need to take. So yeah, so we've done that. Both of the 9-year-olds have stayed home alone with Norman's watch. So there was one day where like my son had a baseball game and I thought it was just here in town. It turned out it was in Colville. So I was a little bit further away than I was comfortable with, but my daughter had just woken up and was not ready to like get out the door. So I had said like, well, do you want to stay here? And if you need me, I can zip back and get you. Cause I thought I was going to be 4 minutes away. Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out we were in the next town over, which is like 15 minutes away. So I was like, and she called me a couple times with questions like, can I have tea? And I was like, yes, make it in the microwave. But you know what I mean? Like, so she called me a couple times, but she didn't need me to come get her. And this is my very like mama attached daughter. I've been letting both of them like either walk with their friends or ride their bikes over to the high school track to practice baseball and softball. Like they just want to go over with their friends and like where they have space to like hit the ball and things like that. So just these little things of letting them go do things outside of me. You know what I mean? Like where they potentially have to make decisions. And I usually will like quiz them. I'll be like, okay, if this scenario happened, what would you do? And they always have good, smart responses. So, I mean, like nothing's more than a 10-minute walk from anything else. And so like our kids know how to get home from any one of the schools, you know what I mean? Like for the most part, our practices, our games are all like they've been taking the dog for walks, you know? So it's just, yeah. So I've just kind of been giving them some of those more, opportunities to be unsupervised.